Throne and Liberty might be the biggest game that you have never heard of, and by the end of this video you might just wish you never had. Throne and Liberty is designed to be a truly next-generation MMORPG experience that boasts a graphically stunning open world, extensive public dungeons, intense boss encounters, an immersive story, guild wars, castle sieges, shape-shifting travel forms, and a dynamic weather system. And it's all coming to PC, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series XS sometime in the first half of 2023. The only problem is it's being developed by NCSoft, a Korean company with a rich history of developing great MMOs, but also a studio that has a reputation of creating heavily monetized pay-to-win systems. So can they really be trusted to bring a next-generation MMO to the global market in a way that is profitable but not outright manipulative? Today I'll be exploring the complicated history of Throne and Liberty's development, uncovering the truth about the game, and trying to determine if the game will really be the success that NCSoft desperately needs it to be. If you're a fan of MMOs, most of you will have probably played a game that was either published or developed by NCSoft. They've had a hand in games like Aeon, Blade and Soul, Guild Wars 2, WildStar, and City of Heroes, a collection of games that have had a really mixed bag of results in terms of critical success. But to better understand the importance of Throne and Liberty, we need to go all the way back to 1998 to the launch of NCSoft's very first title. Lineage was a 2D isometric MMO with RPG elements in the style of Dungeons & Dragons that became a smash hit in the Korean market. Lineage was the first MMO to ever reach 1 million subscribers, and at its peak, the game had over 3 million concurrent players, which was undoubtedly impressive for the late 90s and early 2000s. While Lineage had a lot of hallmarks of classic old-school MMOs, it became known for its formidable free-for-all PvP. In Lineage, player killing was permitted almost everywhere outside of a few dedicated safe zones. These intense player versus player interactions, where only the strongest or most organized survived, encouraged players to group together into what Lineage called blood pledges. These early guilds engaged in massive siege warfare over the various castles found in the game. Once a castle was captured by a blood pledge, players could be taxed on the items purchased from the vendors within their sphere of influence. This system helped create the sense of a dynamically changing world with geopolitics and drama around every corner. The original Lineage was not only one of the most played MMOs ever, but along with games like Ultima Online and EverQuest, it is a foundational piece of what MMOs would eventually become. Eventually, NCSoft decided to capitalize on the success of Lineage, releasing Lineage 2 in 2003. Despite technically being a prequel to Lineage 1, Lineage 2 expanded on the high-octane PvP of the original, using the increased power and immersion of a 3D engine. The game also introduced dedicated story chronicles and dedicated expansions that added new features and content over the course of the game's life. But again, this focus on player versus player combat and the systems that facilitated it were what the game came to be remembered for by many, and would become a staple of popular Eastern MMOs for the next decade and beyond. Lineage 2 was enjoyed by over 14 million unique users, and the game is still talked about with a passionate nostalgia, akin to that of vanilla WoW here in the West. So how does Throne and Liberty relate to a series of games that came out in the early 90s and 2000s during the golden years of MMOs? Well, Throne and Liberty has been in development in some form or another for at least 10 years at this point, being delayed and restructured several times over during this period. Throne and Liberty was originally unveiled at Korean game convention G-Star in 2011 under the name Lineage Eternal. Lineage Eternal aimed to bring the franchise back to its isometric roots, using, of all things, a version of the original Guild Wars engine. The game introduced a really interesting style of hybrid combat that encouraged players to drag the mouse cursor around the screen to cast select spells and abilities. The trailer that released at G-Star maintained that PvP would still be a focus, but 90% of the trailer stresses environmental interactions, dungeon crawling, similar to Diablo, and cooperative player versus environment gameplay. Players and news outlets at the time seemed to be cautiously optimistic about this new direction for the Lineage franchise, and NCSoft appeared to be ready to tie some of its well-being as a studio to its coattails. I say this because 2011 was also the year that Lineage 1 servers would go offline in the West, followed by the news that after 8 years of subscription service, Lineage 2 would be shifting to a free-to-play business model. So, Lineage Eternal subtly became a game with a lot riding on its success. Unfortunately though, Lineage Eternal would continually be hamstrung by a combination of development issues and the shifting expectations of modern gamers. After 2011, there was very little news on the progress of development, and the specifics of the problems that NCSoft were struggling with were not exactly clear. However, what we do know is that during this long wait for new information, resources began to be siphoned away from Lineage 2, and pay-to-win monetization and botting slowly started to creep into the game. It wasn't until 2017, about 6 years after Lineage Eternal's initial announcement, that the news broke. An annual NCSoft conference call confirmed that after poor feedback in early closed beta testing and a failure to reflect NCSoft's characteristics, Lineage Eternal was going to be reworked from the ground up. This included everything from upgrading the engine to Unreal 4 to an overhaul of the dev team itself. This new project would be dubbed Project TL, or The Lineage, but once again concrete details about this fresh new direction would remain elusive. There were brief fears that the game had been cannibalized by a much more easily monetized mobile MMO project. Despite these rumors, NCSoft continued to insist that the game was still alive and in development, going as far as to say that beta testing was slated for 2018. This story continued with the game in limbo for another couple of years until 2022, when a trailer for Throne and Liberty finally released, confirming that the game had yet again been redeveloped several years prior. But unlike Project TL, Throne and Liberty was being billed as an all-new IP, no longer a direct follow-up to the Lineage series. However, as we will discover later, Lineage has still had a very strong influence on the direction of Throne and Liberty. So what's the point of all this build-up? Is Throne and Liberty really worth paying attention to after all this time? Personally, I was first drawn to Throne and Liberty because of the surprising scale and ambition of the project. Now, knowing the history of what Throne and Liberty was supposed to be and how it was developed, I understand how such an apparently big-budget title went under the radar for so long. Graphically, the world looks really good, as is usually the case with Eastern games, but I was surprised to learn that Dociu, a former ArenaNet art director for Guild Wars 2, was brought in as NCSoft's global art leader in an attempt to better adapt their games to the sensibilities of Westerners. And I think you can see some of the influence of his work here in Throne and Liberty. Not only does the world look great, but it's also completely open, meaning no loading screens, and this extends to the game's dungeons, which can be simultaneously explored by multiple parties at any given time. Throne and Liberty also claims to have a dynamic world, which I feel like I've heard countless times from a variety of different games. However, Throne and Liberty takes a slightly different weather-based approach. The weather in Throne and Liberty will have tangible consequences for the way you play. For instance, casting a basic lightning-based ability when it's sunny and clear out will only affect a single target. However, if it's raining, this ability affects multiple targets and will jump between enemies. Similarly, wind will affect projectile abilities, increasing or decreasing the range and success of your projectiles based on the strength and direction of the wind. This also applies to the day and night cycle as well, which can affect anything from the types of mobs that can spawn in a certain area to the power level of some bosses. This makes the night a potentially important time to complete events or gather resources that might otherwise not be available. Early footage and translated spell abilities suggest that skills will also have different effectiveness or perks depending on the time of day. For example, the dagger skill Venom Blood will have an increased poison duration by 20% at night, while doing 20% more base damage during the day. Another dagger skill, Ghost Step, will increase your movement speed anywhere from 30 to 42% at night, depending on the rank of the ability. But by far my favorite stipulation of the night cycle is that player killing becomes unrestricted. Well, sort of. It's not completely clear how this system's gonna work, but according to the developers, most zones will be safe zones, with only a select few areas having PvP enabled. During the day, player killing seems to be discouraged and can incur penalties through the evil deed system. At night though, you are not penalized for player killing, and it's possible that some normal zones could become PvP enabled during this time. While I know PvP isn't for everybody, I do love the idea that for the hour or so that it's nighttime in the game, you and your friends can go hunting for other players, and because of the game's New World-esque open class system, possibly even design your character to use abilities that are more powerful during this period. It'll be interesting to see how these systems interact with the game's castle sieges. These sieges seem to be a direct callback to Lineage, but one of the clear standouts of this iteration are the massive player-controlled golems. In addition to breaking down castle walls, these golems seem to be able to carry players and also engage in heavy-hitting combat with opposing golems. We do know that these sieges will have a couple of different variables depending on the weather. The developers have specifically mentioned that there will be alternate entrances like tunnels that may only be accessible when the weather's clear. There are also going to be these rare, kind of strange, ultra-long cooldown abilities that can be obtained by players that temporarily change the weather or time of day. And getting access to these abilities could be crucial in castle sieges and might just be the key to swaying the tide of battle. For non-PvP players, Throne and Liberty claims to have a strong focus on challenging PvE content that is the cornerstone of so many Western MMOs. In particular, the game seems to have a variety of large world bosses with somewhat complex mechanics that will require organization and large groups to take down. These bosses could be connected to the game's memorial system, of which we don't really know much, but as far as I can tell, it's a server-wide event chain, similar to that of Guild Wars 2, where content will dynamically unlock based on server progress. We do know that some of the largest bosses will have prerequisites for their spawn, which can be impacted by weather and time of day as well. Interestingly, boss strength will also be a variable depending on the time of day, so some fights may require a real fair bit of planning. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more information about how all this functions in the near future. We don't have a whole lot of information about the game's story, but the developers have said that while it is substantial and important to understand if you want to maximize your experience, it is technically skippable for those not interested. This is kind of interesting because the developers seem to not want players to feel like there's anything that they have to do, which is kind of a refreshing approach. It seems like there's no mandatory content. The previously mentioned open world dungeons also highlight this focus on player freedom. From what we've seen so far, these vast underground zones will contain multiple floors, all uninstanced and accessible from the overworld. They haven't really explained how they will handle boss battles in these dungeons, but the director's preview on YouTube shows a boss fight happening, while other groups of players clear previous floors. This video also seems to suggest that there will be secret entrances to these dungeons, only accessible through the game's special traversal system. And without a doubt, this is one of the most striking features of Throne and Liberty. After developing the game as an isometric MMO and then transitioning to a full 3D play space, the developers took advantage of this new axis by allowing players to shapeshift into several animal forms that provide unique benefits when traveling around the world. For example, players can transform into a wolf for faster land travel speed, a shark for aquatic travel, or a bird for faster air travel and gliding. The bird form in particular seems like it could be a really useful combat tool and a significant part of navigating boss mechanics, as shown in some of the previous trailers. I can also imagine the bird form being pretty useful in PvP situations, either to get the drop on an unsuspecting player or as a really powerful method of escape. The system seems to be directly inspired by the transformations that were in Lineage 2, although obviously significantly upgraded due to a more modern engine. And that's a pretty unique feature to Throne and Liberty as far as I can tell, but what's even better is the game also features the ability to vault over objects like barrels and fences, as well as grapple up mountains and castle walls, adding a whole nother layer of flexibility and freedom to the player's movement. And trust me, there's plenty of other exciting features and things I could continue to talk about for probably a lot longer, but I think it's probably important to move on to some of the concerns I have with Throne and Liberty, given its history and the company developing it. Overall, Throne and Liberty is a really difficult game for me to judge because I genuinely think most of the mechanics and the features that are going to be in this game are pretty fresh and exciting for an MMO. The problem is we don't yet know what business model the game is going to have, and the developers don't have a great track record in this department. The curse of NCSoft in the past has kind of been make really good games and then implement really terrible and toxic monetization. Fans of Lineage, Blade and Soul, and Aeon can probably attest to this. Some people are hoping that Throne and Liberty will be different because it's been specifically designed to appeal to not only the global market, but also to Western players, who are historically a little bit less open to pay-to-win monetization. After all, one of the taglines for this game is play for all, and the developers really seem to be pushing this idea of inclusivity and freedom. However, we do have a short snippet of translated audio from one of their previous investor calls where they specifically address pay-to-win and some of their vague plans for monetization.
So of course, we will stay away from pay to win as much as possible. However, at the meantime, strike a good balance so that we can bring about a good and robust performance. But I would also like to add that there has been changes in the overall global game market regarding the monetization models. Previously, people in North America and Europe, they were very negative and critical about the monetization BMs, but we now see a gradual acceptance of, for instance, battle passes, DLCs, and in-game items, even in these markets.
Yeah, so this snippet isn't exactly reassuring, and that brings me to one of my main worries about Throne and Liberty. At the end of the day, Throne and Liberty has been in development for at least 10 years, and the resources that have been put into the development of this game are astronomical. Some outlets claim this project has cost NCSoft over 100 billion won, or $77 million. There's no way they're going to be able to just write that off as a loss and hope for the best. They will be wanting to make their money back somehow. The cynical side of me believes that the reason this game is being brought to almost every platform possible is because they need to make as much money as they can in order to recoup costs, and that could spell very bad news for us players if the worst case monetization scenario were to happen. So, what kind of monetization will Throne and Liberty have? Well, unfortunately right now we just don't know. The game is supposed to launch sometime in the first half of 2023, and they still haven't released any details of what kind of business model they're going to be working with, although there were recent rumors that it will be free to play. There was some footage that surfaced a couple years ago of an early build of the game, and through this footage we can extrapolate a little bit more about what we could expect in the monetization department. But please keep in mind that this information is about 2 years old at this point, so take everything I'm about to say here with a very generous helping of salt. One of the very first things that stood out to me from one of these early build videos is the presence of what seems to be an Aeon or Lost Ark style crafting and enchanting system. These systems have become really popular in free-to-play games, and not without some controversy. You see, these crafting systems usually feature an element of risk in that your craft or your enchant has the potential to fail, and for you to lose the materials that you gathered. This risk will generally increase as the power level of the item you are trying to craft goes up. Unfortunately, these systems often reward players for paying real money to increase their chances of successfully crafting an item, but because there's always an element of chance, this can still feel really bad for players. Lost Ark in particular has a particularly egregious version of this system where there are 20 plus levels of honing for gear, and at the highest levels, the base chances of success can be as low as 0.5%.
Oh my god, now I'm out of these? Are you kidding me? I'm out of I'm out of yellow rocks.
This imbalance of power based on someone's willingness to spend money can become very damaging for the game. It can create what is essentially a digital arms race between players who are racing to become the best geared in order to dominate the playing field of other users. It's of course also bad for PvE players, but it's usually felt most potently in PvP spaces, especially because in Throne and Liberty there's going to be a system where you can pay gold to mock a player that you kill in PvP. If NCSoft were trying to go full cash grab, I imagine that they would want to capitalize on the competitiveness of their player base. So we know at one point NCSoft were testing the idea of a system similar to Aeon or Lost Ark. We have no way of knowing if this is still in the game, and it's possible it could be different depending on the region you're playing in, but I do think gear honing would make sense given its popularity recently. This is, of course, not ideal, but there are some things that could be done to minimize its severity. Firstly, and most importantly, if there is an upgrade or enhancement system that can be influenced by putting real cash into the game, there needs to be a relatively low hard cap on player power. For example, there shouldn't be like 25 plus levels of enhancing to chance your way through. Instead, there needs to be something much lower like 10, and the materials should be reasonably accessible with a limit on how many times players can fail an enhancement. Additionally, this cap shouldn't be continually increased as the game ages. Secondly, the game should have a complex combat system that rewards skill-based play. In other words, in the context of player versus player combat, where imbalance is felt most strongly, the best geared players should be able to be killed by players who are more skilled than them. This will generally reward players who understand the intricacies of the game. Luckily, the game seems to have a pretty fairly complex combat system that features timed blocking and parrying, so I think that's a pretty good sign. And thirdly, there must be diverse ways to obtain good gear. For example, bosses could drop powerful items that require no honing or enchanting, or they could just drop gear that's already fully upgraded. Of course, pay to win is a sliding scale and there are a lot of different levels of it, but the cold reality is that if the game is genuinely fun, there could be a lot of pay to win or insidious systems that can be added to the game without too much pushback. So the best thing we can do is, well, first of all, cross our fingers and hope for the best, but second of all, provide feedback as soon as Western testing starts. The second standout from these early builds is, for me, by far the most concerning though. In addition to the travel and cosmetic transformations, like this orange, Throne and Liberty also seems to have combat transformations. All the transformations in the game except the cosmetic skins seem to have an influence on player stats. This is obviously pretty clear with the travel forms because you gain access to different movement types, but for me, there is a very clear and obvious concern with outfit skins having combat stats. Because, where do you think these skins will be purchasable? Now, this isn't the most surprising revelation because Lineage also had a similar system of polymorphing, and most recently in the mobile game Lineage W, this system has been manifested in its full pay-to-win horror. In Lineage W, you can take on the appearance of other characters from several different tiers of strength. The most powerful tend to let you take on the appearance and stats of actual story characters, but require contracts to use. Stats from these transformations can range anywhere from melee damage +5 to attack speed +100. The mechanics of this are obviously terrible, and no one wants combat bonuses to be sold in a cash shop. But from a design perspective, this is just a terrible borrowed power system that I'm honestly a bit surprised Blizzard never tried to replicate. I mean, why spend time customizing a character and leveling a specific set of abilities if you have to transform into another character to be your most powerful? This destroys any connection you have built with your character, and I would far prefer to navigate a chance-based crafting system than this particular garbage. Again, if the most efficient way to play the game is to play as something other than your character, that is bad. Fortunately, I've not found any additional evidence of these combat skins in the more recent trailers or footage we've seen so far, so they're either testing this still, hiding it, or hopefully it's been removed. Two features that do still appear in footage are the autoplay and mini-pet systems. Autoplay, or automated hunting as it was known when it was added into Lineage 2, is a system that allows players to automate various parts of their gameplay. In Lineage, this was kind of a more complex macro system that included actions like auto-consumable use, auto-use next target, auto-pickup, auto-skill, and more. So we can expect something similar in Throne and Liberty as indicated by this subtle, small, crossed swords icon. This is a feature that is much more popular in Eastern games and many mobile titles, but there are a couple of reasons why I obviously think autoplay isn't a good sign. First of all, this might tell us a lot about the level of grind that will be required to craft or upgrade gear and the severity of that failure rate. I also worry that autoplay will be labeled an accessibility or convenience feature, which I can understand, but then be played off as a catch-up mechanic to minimize the gap between free-to-play players and pay-to-win players. I mean, if you have to AFK grind while you're not playing in order to keep up, something is seriously wrong there. This will also unfortunately greatly encourage multi-boxing and other general forms of botting, essentially making it a feature of the game. I was originally really worried about what this could mean for the combat in the game, but after seeing the relative complexity of the skills and some of the encounters, I'm fairly confident that autoplay will not actually be that useful in real combat with other players or bosses or in dungeons, and will hopefully be limited to grinding mobs or gathering. Autoplay also could just be a weird, cheap effort to legitimize NCSoft's supposed mobile streaming service. But this is definitely a system to keep an eye on to see how it's implemented in the full release. The final element that appears both in early game footage and the most recent public releases are the presence of these small mini-pets that float behind a lot of the characters you'll see on screen. These really didn't catch my attention for a long time because, as someone who plays a lot of Guild Wars 2, I assumed these were fully cosmetic and not really that important. However, this could be another feature stripped from Lineage W, which is a pretty worrying trend. In Lineage W, these are called dolls, and in addition to being these cool little fellas, they can also provide you with extra inventory space, an XP boost, or even buffs and combat stats. With the highest tiers, yes, these are also upgradable, providing relatively substantial damage resistances and critical strike increases. Having a system that makes mini-pets functional and important is kind of a cool concept on the surface. For example, I really don't mind the idea of your pet increasing your carry weight limit, but there are obvious concerns about this becoming pay-to-win if the minis give powerful stat bonuses and are acquirable through a cash shop. As just a quick side note, some of these minis look like they're directly inspired by characters from an upcoming NCSoft mobile game called Puzzup Amatoy. It looks like it's some sort of Candy Crush clone, honestly. But based off rough translations, these pets seem to be called Amatoys, so the more you know. So that's almost everything we know about Throne and Liberty so far, and there's a lot to like. The focus on PvP systems and content that is replayable and self-made is what so many existing MMOs seem to be missing out on, and it's what games like Vanilla WoW successfully tapped into in the early 2000s. It's kind of funny because at some point since then, MMOs moved from being less like a sandbox where interactions with other players were what the game was about, to being more like a theme park where new content has to be continually developed in order to keep the player base engaged. I mean, oftentimes an expansion will be in development for years, only for a majority of the content to be consumed by the players in a matter of days or sometimes even hours. Throne and Liberty seems to aim to have a more balanced set of content, at least as far as we can tell. However, at its worst, Throne and Liberty does kind of have the potential to be a masochistic experience with a manipulative, pay-to-win monetization designed to take advantage of PvP-obsessed whales. Of course, the reality, come release, will probably be somewhere in the middle. Throne and Liberty will supposedly launch in the first half of 2023 according to NCSoft. They have reconfirmed this a handful of times, but we've had so little information since the announcement that Amazon would be publishing the game, and based on the history of the game's development, I wouldn't be surprised if there was another smaller delay incoming. There are rumors of Amazon holding an internal test, but I've yet to see anything substantial enough to prove that one way or another. Either way, there's almost no marketing for this game, and it's supposedly coming out in just a matter of months. It also seems like a really short turnaround for Amazon to launch such a big game, so I'll be keeping a close eye on any updates that come out. Again, the game undoubtedly has a lot of potential, but the developers and the player base might have to navigate some fairly substantial obstacles to ensure that the game is both profitable and a fun experience. Hopefully this video has given you a little bit of an idea of what to expect from Throne and Liberty. Personally, I think I am planning on giving the game a chance when it eventually releases. Even if the game is bad, MMO launches are almost always an experience worth participating in, for the chaos if anything else. So let me know in the comments what you guys think of Throne and Liberty and if you'll be giving it a try when it eventually releases. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.